Oh, hey folks. Give me just a minute. I'm going to go ahead and pour this into my glass here and we will get started. Get my fingers in there. Today I've got a absolutely fantastic little beer. It's a Green Man ESB from Asheville, North Carolina. If you ever get a chance, go up there and get some. I'll pour it real easy right now. But I did want to say I've got a little bit of a different thing going on today. I am going to not do a review on a beer. It's not going to be this one. And so we're going to do a little bit of a talk today instead of a review about brewing and the brewing process. We're going to do it on So like I said, we're going to do a little bit of a talk today about some interesting facts about the brewing and brewing process. So to give you a little bit of a backstory, a friend of mine and I were at a little brew pub close by and sitting at the bar. There was glass between us and all the tanks in the back. And he looked at me, he says, "You know about beer, don't you?" Well, yeah. He says, "What are all those tanks and what does all that equipment do?" We got into a little bit of a discussion about the process of brewing. He was actually pretty fascinated because he had never really experienced it. Never really went to a brewery or a tap room or anywhere where they produce their own beers. So I got to thinking, instead of doing my usual beer reviews like I normally do, I wanted to talk about the basics of brewing. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into the process. It is a science, it's a passion, it's an amazing skill that every brewmaster masters before they go and they produce their own beers. They got recipes. It's almost like being a chef, if you would. But I did want to talk about just the basic brewing processes, how things go from A to B. And I'll try to be as brief as possible. Try to be as high level as possible. If you want more, I may go into that. You'll just have to let me know in the comments. But I did want to start out a little bit about the history. Now, brewing has been around for a long time. The Phoenicians, the Egyptians, all the way up through the Middle East, all the way up into, yes, the Baltics, Germany, all the way through Europe, Central Europe, all the way into England and about. It migrated from there into the Americas. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think there were some Native American tribes, native to the Americas, that were actually doing sort of kind of the same thing. Now, the history of that, of course, is taking grains, soaking them, and through some sort of magical process, you get a drink that's not only stable, but also enjoyable. I mean, it has a little bit of an alcohol into it. There's not a lot. But the idea was that it was liquid bread. And in some cultures, it was actually used as payment for services rendered. In those cultures, they enjoyed beer, they enjoyed brewing, they enjoyed making it. It was a social thing. It was a food substance. You know, it was a part of their heritage, part of their culture. They loved it. Now, that's the overall history of beer. It's one of the oldest forms of refreshment, I guess you would say. It also helped keep a lot of the waters that could have been contaminated with other pathogens safe for drinking. We're going to move into the different processes. Now, the first thing we're going to find is the basics. We're going to get the recipe, and we're going to talk about that in just a few seconds. Like I mentioned a few seconds ago, beer is, in some cultures, it's considered liquid bread. And there's a reason for that. You see, beer is made by grains, much like wheat, barley, rye, corn, for that matter, rice. The starches are used to produce the fermentable sugars that go into the fermentation process. When a brewmaster decides he wants to make a certain type of beer, he's got to look at the list of ingredients available. It's kind of like, do I want to make whole wheat bread, white bread? Do I want to make banana bread, zucchini bread? Do I want to make anything like that that's specific to a type of recipe? And in those recipes, they're going to specify what types of grains they're going to use. Now, these grains are going to be called malts. Notice malting, without going into the science, malting is taking a grain, starting it in the germination process, that's getting it to sprout, and then stopping that process. They can do other things to it. They can toast it, they can color it, they can put it under smoky fire to give it a little bit of a different flavor. They can do all sorts of things to that malt, but it's going to come out with those characteristics. That brewmaster has got to know what malts do what. Now from there, he'll take all those malts together and he'll grind them up. And you'll see some pictures here too. I'm going to put up some during the talk here. But he'll grind them up and he'll use those grains in certain proportions to create what they call a mash. Now the mash is what we're going to talk about next, and no, it has nothing to do with the 70s television show. But stick around for that, we're going to talk about that next. Now, along with the grains, the brewmaster has to consider three other things. You've got the grains, that's your malt. You've got your water. Water is incredibly important. I've got a little story on that one that I may share at some time. You've also got hops. And then you've got these magical little bitty creatures called yeast. Now, much like in any type of bread making, you're going to have some sort of a leavening agent that rises up. If you've smelled yeasty bread, it kind of gives that neat odor to it. But the yeast is going to produce that overall magic. Now, once we get our grains together and we've crushed them, our next step in the process is going to be to mash the grains. Now, mashing doesn't mean mashing them down. It means to take them, soak them in hot water of a certain temperature for a period of time. What that does is it uses the chemicals that has been produced by the malting process. Those chemicals are actually enzymes, like you would your saliva or your digestive enzymes. They convert starches to sugar. Now, the same thing happens in the mash process. Those enzymes convert the malt, starch in the malt, to sugars. That's fermentable. Now, in the process of mashing, they'll take, again, a lot of hot water, their grain, or what they call a grain bill, that's the overall percentage of grains they're going to add, put them in there, soak them for an hour, maybe 2 hours. During that process, those starches will convert to the sugars. They'll drain that, it's called the wort at that particular point, and they'll recycle it a couple of times. They actually use those spent grains to act as a filter. Now, after which they still need to run a little hot water to get all the rest of the sugar water out. And they'll take that wort and they'll transfer it to the next part of the process, which is called the boil. Now, we're going to talk about that right now because we're going to have some really cool things going on there. So stick with us. So the mash process is complete. We've converted what starches we can into fermentable sugars, or fermentable sugar water for that matter. That's called the wort. The brewmaster will take that, transfer it to another tank where he'll boil that. He'll actually bring it up to a boiling point. You'll take from there the next ingredient. Remember, we have the water, we have the malt. We've actually taken the malt, we've mashed it, we've made it into sugar water. Now we're going to take things like your hops. Also, we could take other ingredients that we haven't mashed and put it into the boil. There are certain spices or whatever we want to put in there that we can put right into the boil. But we're going to take our hops. Now, hops are flowers. They're flowers of the hops plant. They do a number of magical things to the beer. First and foremost, they're going to give us our flavor. The bitterness. They're going to give our floralness. Maybe sometimes it gives it a little bit different taste, like it may be a citrusy flavor, some sort of a fruity flavor, a spicy flavor. In some beers, you may have like Pilsners that are kind of spicy. But these hops are included in different styles of hops to do certain things. They're also going to have acids in them, which gives it its bittering. But hops also acts as a preservative. Very important. If you've ever had a true IPA, not like some of the ones we make here, but a true IPA, an IPA was higher in hops content when it was made to survive the months-long journey from England all the way around Africa to India. It needed that survivability, so hops actually provided that. Lots of other characteristics to hops. Now, when they do the boil, they're going to include the hops at different stages. First, they may dump in an inclusion of hops of certain type of hops, and that right there would give you like your bittering or your acids or your initial flavors. And then later on in the boil process, they'll start to add in different hops for different characteristics. Maybe at the final stage, maybe 15 minutes before the end of the boil, they'll add in another hop. And that hop right there will give it its final flavoring. Well, for now, we'll talk about that in a minute. Once the boil is complete, the next step is called fermentation. We've got to get it out of the boil tank and into the fermenter. Before we do that, we have to pass it through a heat exchanger to bring the temperature from Fahrenheit 212 down to somewhere in the range of about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. But that is the boil process. Of course, naturally, we're going to have other inclusions of other things in there too. The boil also provides the ability for any particulates, any solids, any proteins, any other matter that's in this wort to finally coagulate and to fall out. So it clarifies the beer a little bit. Once it's out, it goes to the fermenter, it gets cooled down, and that's our next step. So here's what we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about fermenting. So fermenting is where most of the magic happens. And it's really easy to see a fermenter. I'll have a picture of a fermenter up here. But fermenters are these large tanks that usually have a conical bottom to them. It's very easy to see. The mash tun is what they call it, the boil tun, and they're going to be pretty much identical. They may be different sizes, depends on what the brewmaster wants to do. He may mash a couple of times and then boil that single version of those mashes, or he may do them one at a time. It really all depends. But that fermenter is going to contain the final product, or close to the final product. Once the wort is cooled down to about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, they're going to take that, they're going to put that in the fermentation tank. They may have to cool it down a little further depending on what type of beer they're going to make, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But they're going to put that in there, and then they're going to take their yeast. Usually they have a nice big jar, a flask of yeast that they've prepared. They prepared enough of it because they want to have enough to start that fermentation process pretty quickly. At that point, the yeasts go nuts. They eat all of the fermentable sugar, or as much as possible, that's in that wort. Depending on the style of beer, that fermentation process could take, let's say, a couple of days, maybe a week, all the way up to a couple of weeks. And even then, sometimes they may go from one fermenter to another, what they call secondary fermentation. They may take and they may include other ingredients to that already fermented beer to be able to spice it, to be able to flavor it, to be able to color it, to be able to do whatever they want to with it. But they're going to put that in there at that secondary fermentation. Now, again, I mentioned they're going to pitch yeast, and they're going to pitch yeast for two different families of beer. And we're going to talk about those two different families coming up next. So the brewmaster, from the get-go, he decides whether he wants to make an ale or a lager. These are two different families of beer, for instance. Okay, so we've got the Green Man ESB. The Green Man ESB is an amber ale. Now, usually an ESB would be an ale. A lot of beers that come from Germany and Poland and Bohemia and Czechoslovakia and the Balkans, they're going to be more lagers. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Things were a little colder, so they had to figure out which yeasts would work better in the different environments. Lagers ferment best at somewhere between 41 and let's say 55, 56 degrees, depending on the lager. Those yeasts, the Saccharomyces pasteurinalis, they work better at those lower temperatures. Whereas in places that's a little warmer, places like ales, like Asheville, it's easier to produce. Reason, they don't have to have that cold environment in which to produce those wonderful beers using Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Those are going to be at higher temperatures. They're going to be about 61 degrees all the way up to maybe mid-70s, depending on what you're doing. They're also going to give different taste characteristics. Usually, lagers are going to be lighter in color. They're going to be clearer. They're going to be a little spicier, maybe a little drier. They're going to be maltier. They're going to have more of the malt flavor than would be the hops flavor, even though hops can be very prevalent. However, ales are going to be the ones that are going to have the more floral, the more fruity, the more in-depth flavors. They may have, they may be cloudier. They may have orange. They may have pineapple, apple. They may have any numbers of different beautiful flavors. I've had one that was pear flavored. So you can pull these fruity flavors out. You can pull the spiciness out, depending on how the brewmaster wants his beer to taste. And the yeast are a big part of that. So you've got those two families of yeast. They're going to contribute to the quality of beer. One other thing about lagers is lagers are actually stored, or at least they're supposed to be. Traditionally, a lager would be put in a cave. Why? Well, they would brew the lager during the spring. They would take the beer, they would keg it, and they would put it into caves roughly about 50 some odd degrees, 52, 53, 55 degrees, and they would keep it over the warmer German summers, or the warmer summers during that area. At that point, another type of magic happens. The remaining yeast will finish up fermentation, they'll fall to the bottom, they'll take with it any odd particulate matters, and they'll clarify that beer. It makes it a little bit brighter, it makes it a little bit cleaner, it makes it a little bit more enjoyable, to be quite honest. And from there, they'll bring it out during the fall festivals, and they'll open it up and they'll consume it. So lagering a beer is a great way to keep all your kegs and all your beer safe and cool all through those warmer summers there in Central Europe. Those are the two families of the beers. And a brewmaster will know what he wants to produce at any given time, what malts, what water he wants to use, the hops he's going to use, and the different yeast. We see a lot of ales around. So that's our talk on the basic brewing process. Hopefully you've learned something today. Stay tuned. We're going to close this out right now. There you go, folks. Listen, I appreciate you being here today. It really wasn't a review, but like I said, my buddy and I were talking about it, and it just made me start to think, now's a good time to go through all that. I do want to say thank you for being here today. Remember, subscribe. I think it's down here now. Make sure that you ring the notification bell, right? Give us a thumbs up. Pass the word around. We really want to make sure that we can grow the channel, and we want to do more of these for you. So we want to have some interviews with some brewmasters coming up. If you have a suggestion, leave it down below in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If you felt like this one was going to be a little bit more interesting, if you want to learn a little bit more for that matter, let me know. I'm more than happy to see if I can put something together on the more intricacies, a little bit more in depth of the brewing process. Glad to do it for you. Remember, we've got the beer review logbook. Take that with you, put it in your pocket. Write down your experiences whenever you go to a little tap room. You got the beer review score sheet. That is from the Beer Judge Certification Program. The greatest thing about that is down that right-hand side there, you're going to have a list of off flavors, something that may not taste quite right, but you'll have that right there. You have something to refer to. If you're ever in the upstate of South Carolina, the Upstate Ale Trail, go by and pick that up. We have a lot of breweries here. Some of them have gone out of business, just like everywhere else, but here in the upstate, we have a ton of them. We want you to come visit. We really appreciate that. They appreciate it too. Now, as we always say, Prost! Chin chin! Kanpai! Salud! Slancha! And of course from America, cheers. I do love me some green. Go visit these guys. They're great. They're in Nashville. Other than that, peace, love, and beer.